Hi, I'm Sani. Coming up on the forum, I'll be having a conversation with Koen and the upcoming conference at Metropolitan State University on overcoming racism. That's coming up next on the forum. Good afternoon. You are watching SPNN's Forum. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and sitting with me today, I'm very excited for his return, is Koen.
Good to see you.
Very good to see you. Looking all snazzy.
Well, I'm trying to keep up. Water finds its level.
My mom says that water seeks its own level. Okay. Well, it's really good to see you again.
It's good to see you as well.
And before we get into the deep meat of the conversation, let's just give the who, what, where, when, and why about the upcoming conference. Now, but first of all, what's it called? What's the name of the conference?
Yep, so the conference is Overcoming Racism, and it is at Metropolitan State University, November 14th and 15th. Okay. And the theme for this conference is cultivating transformation.
Okay.
So really talking about, the workshops will be addressing how it is that all of us can seek transformation. Not that what we are is, as we are, that we're diminished in any kind of way, but that we can be greater than the sum of our parts.
Okay.
And so really thinking about how do you use discussions and conversations to elevate all of us so that we all have equal access to goods, jobs, services, and money, and can reach our full potential.
So it's taking it past, because I hear a lot of people complain about how this generation goes about actually taking action on the changes they want to see. So is this going past the internet and actually having discussions about how we can start seeing more change?
Yeah,
okay.
and also establishing the fertile ground for that change, right? So one of the things that I know is oftentimes young people don't have enough information to make change, or the change that they're making, they don't know why they're making that change.
Right.
Or people will stand up for things and not know the background behind the things that they're doing. And so the conference and the workshops are really geared to give people not only some background, but also some methods and responsibilities to transform themselves and ultimately transform our world.
Okay.
What we know about the systems that we have is that we created them, you know, so we can recreate them in ways that are equitable for everyone.
I know last year you said we talked a lot about people who don't believe there's racism, and the conversation that you were going to have at the conference. I mean, among other conversations, was at least starting that conversation. And I see on the blog so often on Facebook and just articles about people who are like, if you ignore it, that's going to make it go away. How does the conference address stuff like that without becoming redundant? Because for people who understand it, I can see that getting redundant and it becoming a moot point. But I mean, how do you invite new people while keeping the current people who are already aware of racism? How do you juggle out something like that?
Yeah, so here's the funny part. So I oftentimes hear people say, well, can you come talk about diversity at a new level? You know, we've had the 101 conversation. Can we get a new revelation? Can you give us diversity 102 and up to diversity 500? Can you do that for us? And the simple thing is, people have diversity fatigue, but don't know why they have diversity fatigue. Okay. And so people want new revelations, but they haven't mastered the
basic stuff.
They haven't mastered the basic stuff. And so that's the place where we get the old heads who think they know everything, and we invite new people into the conversations just on talking about the basics. And so what are the basics of what it means to be human?
Right.
One of the pitfalls that I've seen, particularly in diversity work, and in the 90s, I give much respect to all those like Kwanzaa Kunjufu, who came before, and he helped to establish Kwanzaa and understanding the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, as a way to encourage Black people to be proud. But one of the things that Afrocentricity did not do, it did not establish or it did not translate into what it means to be human. And so lots of folks translated, Afrocentricity or Egyptian centricity as these things that would help motivate us and pull us up, when in fact what it did was it isolated in many ways us from our humanity and other humans and what it means to be human. And so when we start talking about this in this conference, we'll start really talking about what are the things that make us human, and then why is it that we think that we're different?
Okay, that's why I was wondering what's because I remember you talking a lot about us being human, and I keep wondering what is the importance of it, but it makes sense. If we're all humans, why are we separating ourselves in these groups? And that's when you start getting into have you ever heard of the myth of racism?
Oh,
I've been hearing that more and more.
Oh, yeah, because it is a myth.
Yeah, ultimately, now what I do like to say, and going back to human behavior, culture, there's different things culturally, a set of behaviors that people have been doing for a certain amount of time. I think that shows differences in some way, but even if you look at it, there's still similarities in those.
Well,
so
even if you look at culture, right? So the things that people do, the things that people say, the things that they eat, the values that they have are directly related to the context that they come out of. So for example, here in Minnesota, we have a certain kind of culture, right? So in the wintertime, we have winter carnivals. People cut holes in the ice and they jump in and they call themselves polar bears, right?
And ice fishing.
And ice fishing and all of these kinds of things. Because of the environment, the geographic environment that we're in, we have these cultural norms, if you will. However, in Florida, given the same time, they're not doing those things. Because the context is different. And so, but if we look at the core goals of those behaviors, both in Florida and in Minnesota, the core of the behavior is the same. The implementation of those values is different.
It might be different, but the basis of why we're doing those things has a lot to do with us being humans.
Has a lot with us being humans.
Okay. Now I'm getting to the meat.
Yeah.
How are you going to address, there's been a lot of stuff going on this year. The whole conversation about racism, it's very difficult for people. We have been laying kind of dormant and being in our comfort zones, and as long as it's not bothering me, I don't have to worry about it. But there's been so many things that have come up just recently, obviously with Adrian Peterson and the discussion about spankings and whether that's a cultural thing or a racial thing or a generational thing. What's happening with Mike Brown, what's happening with the situation locally with the young man that got arrested in the Skyways. Are you going to approach any of those things at the conference?
Yeah, we would be remiss if the conference did not address those things. So it would be irresponsible for us to bring folks together and not have some critical conversations about those things. And so this is an opportunity for the community to come join us in these conversations, because if we don't talk about it, if we try to pretend like that stuff doesn't happen, it doesn't get better.
Right, it gets worse.
It gets worse.
What do you say for people who feel like all we're doing is talking about it? What do you, what do you have to say to that? Because in some ways, I know you are aware of how social media has made activism become a little bit more lazy. So what do you say about this? Are there things that come after the conference that we're doing? Are there other meetings?
Yeah. No, we're not asking people to be slacktivists, right?
Okay, I ain't never heard of that one.
Right. So I'm not asking you just to hit a hashtag and save
with the picture up.
Right. I'm not asking you to put a bucket on your head all that. What we are asking, and the goal of the conference is actually to empower individuals to make individual stances.
Okay.
To
In their own respective
in their own
communities.
communities, in your own family, in your own sphere of influence, because that's where real change comes from. Okay. When your uncles or your aunts are telling those inappropriate jokes,
right,
to sit silent and let that happen is irresponsible when
right.
you know. And so what we'll be gearing the conference towards is giving people the confidence and the courage to speak up in their own circles of influence.
Okay.
You know, picket signs and, sit-ins and that kind of stuff is not what we're going towards. What we want is for this revolution to be internalized.
Okay.
That you become the revolution. So, when we start talking about cultivating transformation, we're not talking about somebody else changing, we're talking about each of us changing as individuals. Because what we know is once we get that collective mass, we are unstoppable.
Right.
Once we decide as a people, we've had enough. We've gotten rid of polio, although, some folks may say, well, that's coming back. There are certain things in our society that we've said, we've had enough and we're not going to deal with this any longer.
Right.
And so racism is going to be one of those things that we as a people can decide we're done with it. We're tired of dealing with it. And so that means we have to approach institutions and look at our institutional practices. We have to hold government accountable. We have to encourage individuals in the systems that they're in to make these changes. Because the institutions and government won't do it itself because it's not their job, it's the people's job
to voice their,
to
use their voice,
to use their power. And and we also have to start breaking some of these generational curses or generational mindsets. When I think about Adrian Peterson and spanking his child, there will be a number of individuals, both black, white, and other ethnicities that will say, well, that was done to me. So A, what's the big deal? And B, that's just how things are done. And what I'd like to suggest is going back to talking about context, that we have to take the context as a part of our conversation when we even think about this idea of spanking. Because spanking does not, it all comes out of a context, right? And so when we think about particularly African Americans, and I'll speak specifically about myself, switches and
extension cords.
And all sorts of, objects were used as a form of discipline to me, and my parents did what was done to them.
Right.
And their parents did what was done to them.
Right.
And their parents did what was done to them. And so where did they get these great ideas? Well, when particularly African Americans were abducted from their homeland and brought to this great country, one of the ways to subdue them was to beat their old ways of thinking, their old ways of living out of them.
To change their behavior.
To change their behavior. And that form of behavioral change became cultural, right? Now, here's the problem. What we have to understand is that culture adapts to the context. And when the context changes, culture has to change with it. And so I don't know if you've ever received a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, right? When you get to the 10th generation of that copy, it looks nothing like, or it's not clear as the original.
It's like telephone.
It's like telephone, right? So you pass one message to somebody, and by the time it gets back around, it's a totally different message.
Right.
Well, these behavioral traits can go all the way back to that slavery period, particularly for African Americans, and we haven't been able to necessarily break that mentality that, and you'll hear folks say, well, I'd rather beat you at home so you don't get beat up by, in the past it used to be, the white man. And now folks say, I don't want the cops to beat you and that kind of stuff. And we have to understand we got to change how we even think about that.
That conversation has so many different faces. Many different. I've heard just the blogs it's amazing. Blogs are a double-edged sword because you know what the people are saying, you know what the people are thinking, you're more in tune, but it's a scary place to be because it reflects where we're at in our minds. I've heard people say, well, the prison system is filled with people who didn't get beatings. And I'm always like, is there any statistical way to prove?
Right,
Is there
right.
any way to prove that? And I know that they're saying that in support of it. I mean, and what I have seen and what's shocking to me with regards to culture is I'm starting to hear, and I'm going to be honest, when before this started, I assumed that whooping your kids was a black thing. And I'm seeing people from different cultures going, yeah, we got spankings, it's called something different, but for the most part, parents are calling it discipline. And it's just interesting to see where this conversation is going and how it's really starting to reflect or reveal our ideas of race. It's really crazy to me.
Yeah.
It really is. So my question is, so what does all that mean? What does that translate for you as far as content goes to the conference? Talking about spankings, how is that going to help us? How is that going to help us move forward in this away from racism?
Yeah. So one of the things that we have to understand is that all forms of oppression are related. So racism is connected to sexism, which is also connected to heterosexism, which is also connected to ageism, or the oppression that people with disabilities also experience. So all of those are related. All those isms, quote unquote, are related. And until we start to dismantle one of them, they all will exist.
Okay.
And so,
how are they connected? Is it just because it's discrimination? Is it just our way of, is it because it's classification? How?
Yeah. So the way oppression works is that there is an oppressor group, and then there is the oppressed. And so as long as that dichotomy exists, all of those other things will continue to exist.
Okay, because that's a cultural norm.
Right.
Okay.
Because it's this dichotomy. And one of the things that the oppressor fears the most is what? What do you think the oppressor fears the most? What is the number one thing that the oppressor fears?
That the oppressed gains power and whatever.
And oppresses them.
Okay.
Right? So the oppressor fears being oppressed.
Yeah.
So they consistently oppress
to prevent that
from happening.
Okay.
And so one of the things we have to recognize, and Paulo Freire talks about this, or Paulo Freire talks about this concept, that if we continue with this dichotomy, the fear is that we'll just switch, right?
Instead of equaling out.
Instead of equaling out. And so what Paulo says is that we don't have to have an oppressor, and we don't have to have an oppressed. We can actually have a third way of being. And that third way of being comes when we're in conversation and we talk about the elephants that are in the room, when we talk about the boogeyman that's in the closet, when we talk about all of these secret things that folks typically don't get a chance to talk about, and racism is one of those. Sexual assault is one of those. Abuse is one of those. And oftentimes, particularly when we talk about abuse, people try to use humor as a way to get over or to deal with that humor. So you'll hear tons of stories of people being brutalized and in a joking fashion, and people can come around those jokes and try to use that humor as a healing factor. But we have to recognize that level of beating is in fact brutalization. Right. It is a form of oppression. It is to snuff out, and we also have to recognize that violence does not just come in physical forms, right? So if I disrespect someone, that is a form of violence. If I tell someone to shut up, or I don't want to see you, or I cuss somebody out, or I flip them off when I'm driving down the road, those are all acts of violence, and violence only begets more violence, which is a form of oppression.
Okay. Wow.
And so that's how all of those things are related. And so, as we talk about tools, we have to recognize that we can grow, we can transform, given the right tools and given the right situations and the right information.
My name's Sonia, and you've been watching SPNN's Forum, and sitting with me today is Koen, and we're talking about the upcoming conference.
Yes.
About overcoming racism, cultivating transformation.
Yes.
And I had a question, and I do you ever feel overwhelmed with approaching it? Because there's so many other things behind it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's like this is the door, and there's this huge Vesuvius behind it. I mean, are you ever?
Oh yeah, every day. I am overwhelmed by it, right? And when I was younger, I was a Public Enemy fan, and that was my every time Chuck D would speak, I'm like, back again, rhyme edible, Public Enemy, I was like, let's paint the White House black, we're gonna burn this mother down, all of that stuff. And as I've gotten older, what I figured out is that my role is to play my part.
Okay.
If I just do my part, then I'm passing the baton to someone else.
Right.
If I don't do anything, then I have failed. And so my job is to encourage, is to help people remember what is true and good about them, that they can live to the potential that is within them, be they black, white, Asian, Somali, anybody. And so that's what starts to break down the system of racism. And
knowing what you bring to the
knowing
table.
what you bring to the table and doing what you know to be the best, right? So, I might not be able to do what other people can do, but I can do something.
Right.
And I am going to play my role as significantly as I can.
Okay, and at least look up with other people who have that same perspective, and that's a better way of taking it down. So, because it just seems so overwhelming with everything. That's the whole entire discussion of race this year alone. It's like banging on everybody's door, whereas before I really feel like just last year everyone would throw around race baiting. If you ever discussed anything, it was race baiting, and now it's in plain sight.
It's in plain sight.
It's in plain sight, and
right.
it's really hard does it boggle your mind that people really believe that racism doesn't exist anymore?
No, it doesn't.
Why?
Because
and I've seen this from a variety of cultures and ages.
I think that racism as an institution is so pervasive that, and there's certainly certain sects of our population that don't have to deal with it, don't have to even think about it. That no, it doesn't surprise me. I'm teaching a class. And we were talking about this oppression thing. And so I asked the students, the majority of whom were white folks, Norwegians, right? And so, and I checked, I asked if they were Norwegians, and they said yes.
Okay.
Right? So,
good check.
Yeah, and so we're sitting there talking, and I asked them, I said, can you name 5 hair products that I, as an African American, use?
Okay.
No, not the type, but the brand. Can you tell me brand names? Just name 5. And they looked at me dumbfounded.
I would too, even now.
Right.
Like, I don't know, tell me.
I don't know. But you have some ideas of hair products that we would use, right? And so, because you're African American as well, right? Okay. So
good check.
You're right. So, we have that little small aisle in these major department stores, but, or you can go to, other places like on University, I didn't want to advertise. But I asked them to ask me 5 things that they had to use to get their hair done or as beauty products. And I could come up with 10. They couldn't come up with any for me.
With any at all, right. Wow.
And so when we start thinking about that, why is it that as an African American, I, A, have to know, and B, do know everything about the majority culture, but the majority culture doesn't have to know anything about me.
That's crazy, yeah.
And so, so no, I'm not surprised by that. I'm also not surprised that people have, diversity fatigue, right? Because they've heard diversity, but they've not heard the truth. And so, I was at a conference and I asked people who were in protective services, their job is to protect and serve people. And I asked them, I said, list the Bill of Rights. Give me just the first 10. And I want you to tell me what parts are in each of the Bill of Rights. And guess what? They couldn't do it.
Okay.
So these are people who have badges, who have guns, who are supposed to be protecting and serving our rights, but they cannot name any of them.
So how can
And
they
so
enforce that?
when I start thinking about this stuff, it's not a surprise that people are saying that there is no racism because they don't want to know that there is racism. They don't want to examine the system of oppression because it will require them to do something.
Take a look at themselves.
Take a look at themselves. And so when we start talking about cultivating this transformation, that transformation starts with you.
Starts with you.
If we want to, you know, people throw out the slogan, be the change in the world, or blah, blah, blah. No. Start here. Before you want to change anything out there, start looking within. You know, I was at another training and a woman comes up to me and she's got a biracial child. She's a white woman, and she wants to know, how do I, you know, teach my kid about diversity and stuff? And I said, well, first of all, just teach them the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them
to do to you.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I just asked her, who are your friends? Where do you go eat?
As a parent?
As a parent.
Okay.
Who are your friends? Where do you guys go to eat? What community celebrations do you go to? Because those are the things that actually make the most significance in a child's life or in a person's life. What you're doing, not what you're talking about. You know, and so when we start talking about this transformation stuff, we have to be that transformation, and we have to see all kids as our kids. We should be just, no matter what your ethnic group is, we should be upset at how our public schools may be underserving our students, or why our students are making other choices than to going to our public institutions for education. Because if Target had a product that no one was buying, they would take it off the shelf.
Right.
If we have students that aren't going to our schools or aren't excelling in the way that we want, you know, we have to be critical about how we look at ourselves and say, what is it about us that we need to change, because the market isn't buying our product.
So let's get back into we got to wrap it up. Let's get back into the who, what, why, where about the conference. It's going down on November
14th and 15th.
And first, what's the name of it?
Yep, it is Overcoming Racism, Cultivating Transformation.
Okay.
And one of the things that makes this conference unique is that we get folks from here.
Local.
We get folks who are in the field working. Some of them have been national folks, but we get folks who are actually, their hands are dirty. They're in the trenches. They have calluses on their hands because they've been doing the work. And so there's no magic to this stuff. The magic is in getting all of us to start thinking about what we can do in our sphere of influences, because, you know, people are waiting for us to speak. As soon as we speak up, we have encouraged someone else to also speak up. When we stand up, we encourage someone else to stand up. And that doesn't mean put yourself in bodily harm. It doesn't mean that you have to be abrasive to folks, but it does suggest, and we'll talk about tools, that you can interrupt oppressive behaviors. You can show folks support. You can engage in the conversation. So.
Okay. All right. So again, it's Overcoming Racism, Cultivating Transformation.
Yes.
Metropolitan State University.
Yes.
November 14th and 15th.
Yes.
Overcomingracism.org.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, Andre, for coming in
This
today.
has been such
This has been a real good. I think this conversation was better than last year.
I think so too.
All right. My name's Sana, and you've been watching SPNN's Forum.